Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Adair Turner, Chairman of INET, but actually, for the purposes of this session, more important that I'm Chairman of something called the Energy Transitions Commission, which I will explain what it is in a minute. So, we have a panel on climate change. It's actually the only one at the programme where we focused on climate change. Somehow it has the title, In the Long Run, Are We All Dead? Climate Change and Denial, but I've decided to rename it Achieving a Low-Carbon Economy, Challenges, Technological Progress and Responsibilities. Because I think that's, in essence, what we're talking about. And in fact, we're going to have three different presentations which are going to cover different aspects of the climate change policy agenda. We're going to start, after my opening remarks, with Jim Boyce. Jim is the Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And he has a forthcoming book on the case for carbon dividends. And Jim, in particular, is going to talk about the role of carbon pricing in making sure that we end up with a low-carbon economy compatible with climate objectives. We're then going to have Michael Grubb. Michael and I have worked extensively together in the past. I was the first chair of the UK's Climate Change Committee, which is the UK's committee responsible for driving our emissions reductions by 80% by 2050. And Michael and I got to know each other when he was on that committee. Indeed, actually, we'd met before when you were at the Carbon Trust, weren't you? Michael is now Professor of International Energy and Climate Change Policy at University College London. And what Michael's going to talk about is a slightly different perspective, really, which is on the technological progress and the issue of how technological progress isn't a given, it is induced, and it can itself be influenced by policy. And then we're going to end, third presentation, with Richard Heede. Richard is going to focus on the issues of carbon budgeting not just at the global level, but how much of the carbon emissions come from a relatively small number of companies. And what does that apply for climate accountability, for who's responsible? He leads the Climate Accountability Institute's Carbon Majors project, which is tracing CO2 emissions back to corporates. Because there's an interesting issue here. How much should we see this problem as being created by corporates or being rated by consumers? And who are the people who have to act to deal with it? Let me, before the three of them talk, just say on a small number of slides, about 6 it is in total, my overview on the challenge that we face and some of the things that should make us optimistic that we can deal with it, and some of them which illustrate the sheer scale of the challenge. And I'm going to present some stuff from the work of a thing which I chair called the Energy Transitions Commission. I haven't put the website up there, but it is actually www.energy-transitions.org. You can see our reports from which my slides are taken. The first thing to be clear, and I suspect that both Michael and Jim will touch on this, is what is the size of the carbon budget which is compatible with staying below 2 degrees centigrade or staying below a lower level? How much carbon can we put out? Now, that's not an absolutely certain figure because we have a set of climate models that have different degrees of probability attached to different scenarios. But at least on the Energy Transition Commission, we have taken the following as a reasonable guideline to action. That probably from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, if we are to stay or to have a good chance of staying within only increasing temperature by 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, from the point of the Industrial Revolution at which anthropogenic CO2 emissions really became serious in numbers, we could probably have put out 3,700 gigatons of carbon. But the bad news is that we put out 1.1 of those between 1870 and 1985, dominated by the advanced economies, the early industrializers. We put out another 0.9 between 1985 and 2015, and that has a very, very big chunk from China as a following industrial nation. And we probably have to allow for something like 0.8 as being emissions that we will inevitably put out from the non-energy system. We ought to try and avoid some of those as well, because they are from things like land use, but you have to allow for those in terms of a reasonable estimate as to what the energy system can put out, and you end up, at least in our figures, with over the next 85 years, we better limit our energy system emissions to something like 900 gigatons of carbon. To give you an idea, at the moment, the energy system, in terms of the energy we consume, as part of our economies, is putting out something sort of 42 gigatons per annum. So clearly, if we keep doing that, we're going to run out of road in about 25 years' time. And fundamentally, we've got to take 40 per annum or 43 per annum down to about 20 per annum, gigatons per annum by 2040, and we've got to get it down to 0 by about 2060 or so. And if we're not doing that, we're not being serious about dealing with this problem. And within the Energy Transition Commission, which I chair, and which has an eclectic combination of companies, and be interesting for Richard when he comes back at this, it does include Shell, it does include BHP Billiton, fossil fuel companies. It includes Rocky Mountain Institute, where you used to work. It includes renewable energy companies. But the one thing that we demand when people join the Energy Transitions Commission is that we're all committed to achieving well below 2 degrees centigrade. Now, how do we get there? In the Commission report, we fundamentally say there are 3 ways we get there. We decarbonize electricity production. We work out how to take the carbon out of the things that we can't electrify. You decarbonize electricity and you electrify as much of the economy as possible. You then have to decarbonize even the things that you can't electrify, and you radically improve energy efficiency. You also, within fossil fuel use, should move as much as possible to the fossil fuels which are somewhat less carbon intensive, such as gas, and away from coal. Let me say a few words on those and where we can be optimistic and where we can be, at the moment, less sure that we will do it. The good news is that the cost of renewable energy is collapsing, renewable electricity. Back when Michael and I were both on the Climate Change Committee back in 2008, we did some estimates of what we thought was going to happen to the cost of wind and solar. And I have to say, I hope people have destroyed the evidence of our analysis at that time, because we were completely useless at working out how fast these costs were going to come down. We knew the costs would come down, but they have come down absolutely dramatically. As you can see on this chart, what we call the levelized cost of wind, the cost per dollars per megawatt hour of wind, over just the 6 years from 2009 to 2015 is down about 65%. The cost of solar, a PV-based electricity, down about 85%. And indeed, since 2015, those figures are even down further. If you look on the left-hand side, that 2015 figure on wind is about 60 megawatt hours. We are now seeing on onshore at 35 megawatt hours in the US, and what is happening, even the offshore wind is beginning to get to lower and lower levels. In a sense, the solar is even more dramatic. As you can see, that 2015 figure is still up about 60 US dollars, 60, 70 US dollars per megawatt hour, 6 US cents per kilowatt hour, if you think about how many kilowatt hours you consume. Since then, there are just incredibly dramatic prices being produced for solar energy. The most dramatic, Saudi, admittedly quite a sunny place, so they have some advantages, down at 1.79 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity produced. And I would say that we now should be talking about, in 2017, we should be thinking about the cost of solar as having been down 95% since 2008. Equally important, because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, is what has happened to the cost of batteries. Again, when I was first looking at this back in 2008, 9, 10, people were talking about a cost of battery storage of $1,000 per kilowatt hour. By 2016, that was already down to something like $270 per kilowatt hour storable, and as you can see, tending to come down at something like 20% per annum. I think it is almost certain that by 2020 we will be below $150 per megawatt hour and possibly per kilowatt hour and possibly below $100 per kilowatt hour. So again, we're talking about the price of these crucial technologies coming down by 80, 90, 100% in the course of a decade. This is hugely good news, but it simply didn't happen itself. It happened, and this is what Michael's going to talk about, because there was conscious public policy to say, we will subsidize solar and wind initially when they are much more expensive than fossil fuels, confident that the initial subsidy will get private industry to scale and down learning curves, and then the costs will come down. And I think this is actually one of the most successful examples of an integrative action between government and the private sector, governments taking action that then unleash the activity of the private sector that we've seen. And Michael's going to talk about that. So overall, an incredibly optimistic picture that we fundamentally believe on the Energy Transition Commission that we can, within the next 10 years, produce electricity production systems which are 80 or even 90% dependent on intermittent renewables. We can back them up with a small amount of gas turbines and with lithium-ion batteries, and we will be able to produce electricity at costs which are fully competitive with fossil fuels. That is hugely good news. One of the challenges, however, is that if that helps us get emissions down to, say, 20 gigatons in 2040, we will then be facing a lot of the remaining emissions which are quite difficult to electrify. They're not necessarily impossible to electrify, but they're difficult. They're things like aviation, long-distance trucking rather than short-distance autos, how you produce steel, how you produce cement. And the commission which I chair, the Energy Transition Commission, has now swiveled our focus over the next year. We're basically proselytizing the story that we can fix the electricity problem. We're now focusing on what do you do about those hard-to-abate sectors where it isn't certain and it isn't easy to say, let's just electrify them. And I think what we're going to have to do in those sectors is to replicate the success of the renewables story. What we've seen in the renewables electricity area is public R&D supports early-stage technology, gets the technology to readiness, early subsidies for early deployment, achieve the deployment of the technology, which then develops the private sector to scale where it brings down cost. And we may have to do the same that we did on renewable electricity. We may have to do the same for things like hydrogen, or carbon capture and storage, which may be some of the crucial technologies with which we bring down emissions in the hard-to-abate sectors. Finally, however, what does this mean for the amount of fossil fuels that we can put out into the atmosphere? And then you have to balance it against, can we do it? How big is this challenge? And I think this is then going to relate a bit to the carbon pricing point and to Richard's points about who's putting out these emissions. Broadly speaking, if we are to be able to achieve a well below 2 degrees scenario, how many emissions you put out actually depends on a crucial variable that you don't know, which is how big do you think carbon capture and storage can be as a technology? And carbon capture and storage, unlike renewables, has not come down in price much. It's still pretty much the same cost as it was 10 years ago. And some people, particularly in the fossil fuel industry, I have to say, and Richard made a couple of this, throw in big assumptions about future carbon capture and storage as the get-out-of-jail-free card of why they don't have to cut emissions today. In our work, we had 3 different scenarios. A high scenario in which you can take carbon capture and storage up to 18 gigatons of CO2 stored by the late 21st century. That is huge. Our central case was up to 11, and our low case was none at all. And you can see if you take the central case, which is still very demanding, very demanding in terms of the development of a technology that we really don't know how to deliver cost effectively now. Even on that, you have to have this very significant reduction of total fossil fuel use over the next 25 years. But what is really striking is that then when you translate that in what that means for particular fossil fuels, there is a very important pattern that comes out. We have to cut coal out of the system as rapidly as possible, because coal is very carbon intensive. And unless we're talking about something like a 70% cut in total global coal use within the next 25 years, we're not serious about well below 2 degrees centigrade. Now, at the moment, we don't know how to make steel without using coking coal. So you need to keep some of that budget for coking coal. So you better cut thermal coal use, not by 70%, but by something like 90%. And there are some countries like India, which however much one tries to persuade them and however much they are willing to try, and they are trying, and I've just been down there to drive the development of renewables, are inevitably going to burn some coal because they've got large coal-fired power stations already. So the simple point about thermal coal use for electricity in the advanced economies is it's really got to stop tomorrow if we are in the least bit serious about the Paris climate commitments. The other two fossil fuels, well, gas, probably we need to stop the growth of, but you could have a scenario in which we've not dramatically cut reduction by 2040, but we certainly can't have a big increase. And oil has to be something down like 30% by 2040, below current levels of 1 million barrels a day, if the numbers are to add up. So that gives you an idea of what I think of the scale of the challenge, the scale of the areas of technology where the good news is, and some of the remaining difficulties in getting there. With that as background, let's turn it over to Jim, first of all, to talk in particular about the role of carbon pricing in addressing these issues.
Well, thank you very much, Adair, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. I commend your short-run persistence for making it to the very last panel of a long conference, and also your long-run vision for wanting to be at a panel about the issue of climate change. My paper, which I'm told will be available on the INET website once they get them all up, which I hope will be soon, is about both what economics can and cannot tell us about climate change. And in particular, I focus in on the issue of carbon pricing. I think there is much that economists can offer to the conversation, including much that we can offer with respect to the impact and design of carbon pricing policies as one element in a broader policy mix. But at the same time, I'm going to argue that there are issues on which economists should defer to others. And in particular, I believe we should defer to others on the question of how high we should let the carbon concentration in the atmosphere rise, and associated with that, of course, how much of a global mean temperature increase above pre-industrial levels is acceptable. In other words, I'm going to argue that economists have much to contribute in discussing the means to address the climate change problem, but that we ought not to arrogate unto ourselves the power to determine what the ends should be. And in that respect, I'm going to suggest economists need a bit more humility. As many of you will know, the widely agreed target for stabilization of atmospheric carbon levels is that we should aim for something between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius global mean temperature increase above pre-industrial levels. That's a number that comes from climate science, not from economists, and it's the number that was agreed upon in Paris by the international negotiators in 2015. One might think that economists, as members in good standing of the international community, would take that number and then talk, as we here will be talking today, about how best to achieve that target. But as many of you may realize, A number of economists, prominent climate economists, have not been willing to limit themselves to that relatively modest, though important task, and instead have conducted cost-benefit analyses to prescribe what they describe as the optimal goals for climate policy, the ends, not just the means. And they do this through integrated assessment models, which are basically cost-benefit analyses using conventional techniques applied to the issue of climate change. And they come up with their own targets, which turn out to be, in many cases, very different from the 1.5 to 2 degree target that's coming from scientists and the international negotiators. Many economists, and of course most of the public, are rather unaware that economists have taken on this task. And that's because the numbers are usually expressed not in terms of quantity of emissions, nor in terms of parts per million or temperature increase, but rather under the guise of what is called the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon emerges from these integrated assessment models, and the blue line here shows what the welfare optimizing path is according to one of the most widely used models, and one that comes up in kind of the middle range of the models in wide use, the DICE model of Professor Bill Nordhaus at Yale. And in his latest runs of his model, he suggests that the appropriate price on carbon in the year 2020 would be about $37 per ton of CO2, and that this would rise to a little over $100 per ton by mid-century. To put those dollars per ton numbers into numbers that are more familiar to people, $1 per ton of CO2 is equivalent to about 1 cent on a gallon of gasoline in the United States. So the $100 per ton in 2050 would raise the price of gasoline by $1. In euro terms, it's equivalent to about $1 per ton of carbon is equivalent to about 0.3 euro cents per liter, so it would raise the cost of petrol by about 30 euro cents per liter by mid-century. Now, if you think that's enough to solve the problem of climate change, you're even more optimistic, I would suggest, than we are on this panel. I think it's probably a woefully inadequate price. And interestingly, in his most recent paper, Nordhaus also shows us the price trajectory that he reckons would be associated with a quantity trajectory designed to limit total carbon emissions and global temperature increase to 2.5 degrees Celsius, which is above that 1.5 to 2 degree target. And when we look at those numbers, which are shown in the dotted red line here, he reckons we'd have to start out with a carbon price of about $230 per ton in 2020, rising to over $1,000 in the mid-century. Now, how is it that economists can come up with recommendations like this? Helpfully, we can also calculate from, and Nordhaus has calculated, what the quantity trajectory is associated with different price trajectories. These are, of course, estimates based on projected relationships between quantity and price, which, as we'll talk about, may or may not be completely accurate. But what Nordhaus reckons is that by mid-century, we would have a temperature increase above pre-industrial levels following the recommended optimal path of his DICE model of 3.5 degrees Celsius. That's where we'd be in 2100. To put that in perspective, the last time the temperature of the Earth was that high was 125,000 years ago. And these models are arguing that it would be optimal for my grandson, who I hope will be alive in 2100, to experience those temperatures in his lifetime. Now, you can get lower numbers than that from these models. The Stern Review, for example, used a lower discount rate to convert future damages into present benefits and came up with something more consistent with 2.5 degrees. But the numbers that the SCC, or social cost of carbon, folks are putting out there, I would say are so low, the numbers coming from the DICE model and the other mainstream models, that I think they could be called climate change denial light. They don't deny the reality of climate change, but they deny the magnitude of the damages that would occur. Now, of course, you can go even lighter than that. The Trump administration this month, in its regulatory impact analysis for rolling back, repealing Obama's Clean Power Plan, uses a social cost of carbon of $1 to $6 per ton of CO2, which would add between 1 cent and 6 cents to the price of a gallon of gasoline. They do it by using a higher discount rate and by zeroing out all climate mitigation benefits that accrue outside the United States. This approach to coming up with optimal climate targets is completely consistent with the neoclassical notion that efficiency is the normative criterion on which we should base public policy. As Winnie Byanyima mentioned last night in her talk, it's time to abandon, I think, the pretense that the market should define our directions in all things, and in a way, the social cost of carbon is using quasi-market methods to determine what our climate target should be. The 1.5 to 2 degrees approach, by contrast, uses safety rather than neoclassical efficiency as the basis for setting normative goals. And this is, in fact, the way that a lot of environmental policy is structured. In the U.S., for example, the Clean Air Act mandates that the EPA should ensure air quality that protects the health of the people. Doesn't say it should protect it insofar as the benefits of keeping people alive are worth the costs. Nevertheless, there's an important role for economists in thinking about how best to achieve those safety goals or protection of the planet goals. It would be unfortunate, I think, if we were to throw out the potential importance of carbon pricing as a policy tool along with the social cost of carbon bathwater, because I think carbon pricing potentially is one important piece of the policy toolkit. One reason for this is that carbon pricing, this is the argument typically made by many economists of all stripes, is a way to try to get emissions reductions in the most cost-effective fashion. This chart from the pretty well-known McKinsey study of the late part of the first decade of this century ranked different carbon emissions reductions technologies by their costs and identified a lot of variation. These numbers aren't perfect, and they would look very different if you looked at them today, but the point is that there were a lot of variations, and the rationale, the cost-effectiveness rationale for carbon pricing as an instrument, usually stressed by neoclassical economists, is that it allows actors to, and incentivizes them to pick the low-hanging fruit and achieve the emissions reductions that are cheapest. One thing, before you get too excited about that, it's worth noticing all the options that they reckoned were below the zero cost line. That is to say, those are options for which there were negative costs that would be privately efficient or rational for actors to adopt. And the fact that they exist at all suggests that people don't respond to prices quite the way that simple economic textbooks tell us they do. There's a lot of imperfect information, myopia, imperfect credit markets, etc., that provide one of the reasons why, in fact, instead of relying on carbon prices alone, one needs to have a broader policy mix that include other policies, including conventional regulations, public investment, and so on as well. A second merit of carbon pricing is that it helps to push along the technological change inducement processes that Michael's going to be talking about. It's not the only way to push them along. Again, it's very important, I think, to have public investment as a part of the mix. I'm very pleased to know that in Scotland there's, for example, discussion now of creating a national investment bank, which would potentially help to push that kind of investment, drive the learning curve, drive down costs, as Adair has already mentioned and Michael will discuss more. That's an important part of the policy mix too. But carbon pricing is complementary to state policies that would expedite that technological transition. Finally, another reason why regulations ought to be part of the policy mix, I want to emphasize this because I don't want you to think that I'm saying carbon pricing is the only policy we need or a panacea, is that when we burn fossil fuels, we not only emit carbon, but we also emit co-pollutants that are hazardous to human health, and the extent of those emissions and hazards varies from source to source and place to place. And if we want to take into account the variations in co-benefits, air quality co-benefits from emissions reductions, we need to have policies that aren't just a one-size-fits-all carbon price. In particular, we need regulatory policies that prevent the emergence of what are called pollution hotspots, a very big issue in the environmental justice community. Now, how does one go about implementing a carbon price? This can be done either by setting a price and letting the quantity adjust. That's called a tax. A tax sets the price and lets the quantity vary. Or you can set the quantity and allow the price to vary. That's called a cap. Now, if one knew for sure the relationship between price and quantity now and for the coming decades, it wouldn't matter which instrument one used. However, we don't know that relationship, even in the present, let alone for what the relationship is going to look like over the long run when technological change will kick in at an unknown rate, etc. This curve here summarizes hundreds of estimates of the long-run price elasticity demand in the recent literature, and as you can see, there's a fair range of variation. In general, what we do know is that the price elasticity of demand for fossil fuels is low. The means coming out of this meta-analysis done by Labanderia and his colleagues was a price elasticity of demand in the short run of 0.2 and in the long run of 0.6. What that means in the long run, a 10% increase in the price of fossil fuels leads to a 6% diminution in demand. But we don't really know what those numbers are. And given that what we really want to hit is the emissions reductions target, I would submit to you that the appropriate way to price carbon is not to set a price and see what happens and hope for the best, but rather to set the quantity, either through a cap and permit auction system or by setting a tax that is indexed to quantitative goals for emissions reductions in a way analogous to how variable interest rates are indexed to some other base figure. Indeed, without setting quantitative targets, there can be no guarantee that carbon pricing will be sufficient to ensure the reductions of emissions that we need to achieve to stay within the temperature increase limits that science and policymakers alike have agreed upon. Now, if one prices carbon, this is going to have a profound impact on people's purchasing power if the prices are set at a level that's anywhere near enough to meet the emissions reductions goals that we're talking about. The figures I'm about to show you are calculations for the United States based on a tax of $200 or a price of $200 per ton of CO2. That, by the way, is below what Nordhaus estimates would be needed just in 2030, if in 2020, just to achieve the 2.5 degree goal. So in that respect, $200 per ton is perhaps a modest estimate. Though again, who knows? Maybe technological change will proceed so quickly that the price wouldn't be that high. We don't have to know. All we have to do is set the quantity trajectory and let the price adjust. But for illustrating the impacts of carbon pricing, let's use this as a kind of baseline figure. And looking at the numbers, what one can see are two basic things. First, that this is a significant impact on consumer incomes. Of course, the most efficient way to implement such a price is upstream, where the fossil fuels enter the economy, but that price then becomes part of the cost of fossil fuels, affecting the purchasing power of households, both for their direct consumption and for indirectly via consumption of anything produced or distributed using fossil fuels. So for the various quintiles of the household expenditure distribution, we're talking about impacts that range from over 8 to over 12% of their annual expenditure. That's how much extra they would be spending as a result of a carbon price of about $200 per ton. Also, we can see that the impact is regressive. Among the lowest, poorest quintile, the impact is 12.5%, whereas in the highest quintile, it's less than 10%. The fact that carbon pricing on its own has both a big impact and a regressive impact has very important political implications and ethical implications. When you price carbon, the money doesn't disappear. It doesn't go to Saudi Arabia. It's not shot to the moon. It's not used to purchase resources. It's the price paid for consuming fossil fuels that you did not mitigate. It's not the cost of reducing use, it's the cost for the use you don't mitigate. In other words, the money paid in a carbon price is a form of rent. It's a scarcity rent. It's a protective rent. It's a good kind of rent to have, but it opens up the question, where does that rent go? One possibility is we could give the rent to the fossil fuel companies as some sort of political bargain. We'll buy you out by throwing you this money, which is a considerable amount of money. And that's what cap and giveaway and trade programs do. They call them cap and trade, but the only reason you'd have tradable permits is if you gave them away at the beginning, as we do with sulfur dioxide in the US, rather than auctioning them off. You could auction off the permits and let the government keep the money. And if you did that, the government could use it to cut income taxes, corporate income taxes, which traditionally has been a favored view in the US on the Republican side of the aisle, or use it for various kinds of governmental good works. And what I want to argue is that instead what one should do is dividend much of the money, if not all of it, back to the public in the form of equal per capita payments. And one of the reasons to do so is that by dividending the money back, you convert the regressive impacts of the carbon price alone into a very progressive net impact. This shows what would happen if you dividended back all of the money. Huge increase in purchasing power amongst the poorest, and a relatively modest cut for the rich. Of course, the reason such a modest cut for the rich could finance the increases for the poor is the rich have so much more money to be priced away through having to pay for their use of the global carbon sink. There are three, one last thing I should say is that although we can see those patterns across the vertical distribution of income, within each income quintile, there is some variation. There would be some poor people for whom there would be a negative net impact of carbon pricing, and some rich people for whom there would be a positive net impact. This shows the percentages receiving a positive impact in each decile. What that suggests is that one might want to have some of the revenue being used to address issues of horizontal equity as well. I'll close with the following. I think there are three important reasons for thinking that dividends are an important way to use much or all of the carbon revenue. The first has to do with the political durability of any carbon pricing program. If it's the case that the prices of gasoline, electricity, etc., are going up substantially, this is going to be noticeable. It's going to produce a political backlash unless the money is coming back to the public in a very visible, transparent, and fashion that is widely perceived as being fair. I think any policy that raised carbon prices enough to really have much of an impact would not be politically durable unless that condition were achieved. Second, it advances egalitarian goals. It's not a panacea for the terrible and widening inequality we see in the world today, but it helps. And finally, I think it has some philosophical appeal, because the principle underlying carbon dividends is that the gifts of nature, or what religious folks would call the gifts of creation, belong to us all in equal and common measure. In this case, the gift we're talking about is the limited carbon absorptive capacity of the biosphere, and the principle here is that that belongs to all of us, not to corporations, not to governments, and not to a favored subset of the population, but to us all in equal measure. And in a society where we are riven by differences among people, I think building some things we have in common is a really good idea. So I'll stop there.
Jim, thank you very much. Michael.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think my remarks will actually pick up quite well from both Adair's and some of the points that James made. I really want to zero in on one particular dimension of what is obviously a huge problem and look at it in both micro and macro and then implications respect. Now, I did note that the session title that we were given after the rather depressing first phrase referred to denial, which of course most people interpret to mean scientific denial. And actually, as I reflected on this and following our pre-conference phone call, I thought, well, actually, I think there's another whole area of denial, which is much closer to the terrain of INET, which is about the way that economics has constructed or perceived and modelled part of this problem. So it's that other denial that I really want to focus in on, and it's around the role of innovation and infrastructure, both interpreted pretty broadly, not just technology, but wider systems. And I'll locate it actually in the wider theme of the conference about history of economic thought, because in some respects, nothing that I have to say would be of any surprise to Schumpeter or some of those who studied the solar residual and endogenous change, etc. So innovation has been intrinsic to some branches of economic theory and views of economic growth for a very long time. Innovation's inescapable when we're looking at deep emission reductions. We've known a lot about various properties of endogenous innovation, learning by doing, Kenneth Arrow's paper more than 50 years ago, etc. It is very well documented now in terms of learning curves for technologies. The costs come down as you deploy more. Huge, rich literature on innovation systems. Yet almost every economic model that I have seen in this space actually ignores all of the above. And I want to put my finger on that and to explain why it really matters. So first, just a little bit of background about recent developments, which, as Adair alluded to, are really quite staggering when you look. So this is just the growth, the upper panel, the growth over the last 15 years of wind energy, the lower one of solar. And what you see is over the last decade, we've had about a factor of 5 growth in installed wind capacity and pretty much a factor of 35 growth in installed solar capacity. And as Adair did point out, that has been accompanied by some really pretty dramatic reductions in the costs of those technologies. I would refer to the former as strategic deployment because it was driven by government policy, in part on a justification and expectation of cost reductions, which was indeed delivered. And as I said, there's a much wider literature documenting similar learning effects across a whole range of supply and demand side technologies, energy efficiency, etc. But those are pretty dramatic cost reductions. And when you actually look further at what has economics had to say and where are we now in relation to that, I pulled out a quote from The Economist only 3 years ago, of course, picking up a study which had data from a few years before that, picking up a long mantra of renewable energy is fantastically expensive and it's a crazy way of trying to reduce emissions because it's far more expensive than other things we could do. Well, now, within the space of a few years, we have those numbers that Adair referred to implying that actually solar energy may be the cheapest way of fueling economic development in many developing countries. It's that dramatic. And you can see below that batteries, a similar huge reduction, which of course also may not only help to store renewables, but may spill out into transport technologies. On the right-hand side, what's happened to offshore wind. As Adair said, we both got it wrong on the committee. All the evidence seemed to be, this is a really difficult and I've got to put a wind turbine out in the middle of the North Sea, storms, etc. It's kind of a pretty expensive way of doing it. Well, huge cost reductions, most evident in recent auctions. which actually, as I've started to drill into it, I think could legitimately mean that wind energy starts to take the place of oil and gas, North Sea as a new energy province of substantial economic value. We could debate that. That's not my main contention. The point is, actually, most economic theory most economic modelling applied to this has run models that are now useless because they made assumptions that are already completely out of date. So what was going wrong? Well, most models ignored processes of technology innovation. They thought cost would come down. They made exogenous assumptions about it. That also follows for the Nordhaus's DICE model, but to his credit, Bill Nordhaus did not entirely ignore the issue. He made one stab at doing it, but then really said, yeah, but he doesn't really think it matters very much, partly because it's uncertain. Correlation, sure, is not causation. Price reductions also drive growth. That's, of course, absolutely true. But when you pin down and look at this more closely, partly the timing, capacity growth has generally led to the cost reductions. Clearly, the two would at minimum reinforce each other, and I've referred in the footnote to a study which makes that very plain and does quantify the fact that at a time of declining public R&D, the capacity growth has been accompanied by a huge surge in private patenting. So, of course, there was induced innovation. And it's also common sense. We know about technology learning by doing. We know private sector revenues will enable them to resource private R&D, which is exactly what we've seen. We know we have economies of scale both in unit size and production volume. We develop the supply chains, the infrastructure that supports that, and indeed the increased confidence in the industry, and these are capital-intensive technologies, leads to a reduction in financing costs, which is actually also an important part of the story. Now, my point is, yeah, so there's some uncertainties here, but it's one of these cases where zero is an extraordinarily bad approximation to something that you absolutely know is positive. If you take action, cost will come down. And this is an crucially important area, which partly is, as I said, it means we've got most of the models have been wrong and are outdated. But it's also important in technology terms. And, sorry, in terms of the relationship to the economic theory and advice. We, and I have lived through 2 decades of consistent economic advice across a wide range of economic communities saying this renewables deployment is crazy economics. It is an extraordinarily expensive way of trying to cut emissions. Why? Because the relevant metric is the cost per tonne of CO2 emission reduction, and those things are really expensive, so you really shouldn't have done them. That is completely ignoring learning benefits. It ignores the strategic nature of the problem, and all that we know about evolution, about innovation as an evolutionary process involves private sector, etc., and the interaction between government and private investment in bringing down costs. In the language of the book that I and colleagues came out with, you're effectively using second domain economics broadly based around equilibrium theory to tackle a problem which is fundamentally strategic in nature and requiring innovation and transformation of the systems. So the tools are simply wrong. And consequently, the policy advice was completely wrong. And most of the progress we've made has been by governments that ignored that kind of economic policy advice. And to be blunt, thank God they did. As Laurence Toubiana, who's a special envoy at the Paris negotiations, once asked me to give a lecture, and after I'd accepted, she said, actually, this was really provocative, I was economic positions at the time, she said, has economics helped or hindered? And I think that's one of the things she was driving at in our policy making. Now, we have certainly seen some progress in this area. Economics is moving. I think it's beginning to absorb, and certainly my colleague at Cambridge, David Newbury, has done a really interesting piece actually saying, do you know what, when we factor in learning by doing, that was actually a very sensible policy. It's kind of shame most of that's come after the fact. But it is still ignored in most global modelling of the solution. Now, I pause at this point for a second. One other thing I wanted to raise is to elevate this from the micro-innovation to a wider macro point, because I think this is a wider macro point about the adaptive nature of many economic processes and systems. This will look like a slightly odd graph. What it actually shows vertically is basket of end-use energy prices aggregated over the last 40 years. and horizontally energy intensity. The curved red line is the line of constant energy expenditure, because that's the product of energy price and the amount of energy that you consume per unit of GDP. What's interesting about this? Well, when you scatter countries all over it, you discover that actually countries end up spending pretty much the same amount on energy, whatever their energy price has been. So at the top left, you have countries like Switzerland, highest, Denmark, Italy, to some extent Japan. Energy prices twice as high as in the United States, but they use energy twice as efficiently or as productively, so the bill is the same. And on the right, you've got the former Soviet countries subsidized energy on the grounds that this was good for economic development, etc., have ended up actually with crippling energy bills. They're above the red line because they became so structurally inefficient. And I think one of the things that points to, this picks up James's data about kind of where I stand on the long-run elasticity, when you look across countries, you are picking up a whole range of adjustment processes. If energy is more expensive, is scarcer, you innovate, there's structural adjustment, you build infrastructure, say, to support high-speed trains rather than highways, all sorts of things. But that's a wider adaptive process, which is potentially very good news for the narrative around carbon pricing. Now, to take me on to the very final area I wanted to flag, maybe worth saying that I think some of the real sort of classical economics community would know that I'm a bit of a fraud in this place, because although, yes, I was at economics faculty in Cambridge and worked as chief economist at the Carbon Trust, I started life as a physicist and moved through systems engineering and international relations, where I discovered just what a problem the economics narrative was in this space. Two things I really took away from that. One was some factions of the economics community, how little attention they seemed to place a weight on the empirics rather than the theory, and I hope that is changing. The other is, of course, I realised you couldn't be taken seriously in economics without a model, so I have one. And the problem of modelling in this space has been it's fantastically complicated, right? You build in learning curves, you build in learning by doing, etc., etc. These models start to behave really weirdly. They can go in all kinds of directions and for very similar costs. That is actually very important. Think philosophically about what's saying. It says, well, actually, it could be all kinds of different futures, and we're really not sure which is cheaper, because technology could evolve in all sorts of different directions, and so could systems. Well, the problem is those are very sensitive, you need loads of input, you need learning rates, etc. So I kind of boiled it down and said, look, what's really going on here? You can create a reduced form model which says we're talking about systems which have some degree of adaptability. And so let's have a standard classical term, which is the cost of deviating from a reference, and a cost of transition, which is saying, well, maybe some of this is just the effort. You know, this is how much money Germany had to put in to drive those cost reductions. This is how much the infrastructure would cost that could support a renewables future. Or it's just the political resistance of change. So you have two terms. It's that simple. Well, actually, there's shed loads of maths under it, but never mind. The basic fact is the ratio of the cost of change versus the enduring cost is effectively a reflection of the adaptive capacity of the system. It is overcoming the resistance to change rather than an enduring cost of meeting a constraint in 100 years' time when, frankly, we have no idea how innovative we might be. And then I added to that a classic temperature function, very much like the DICE model, and I took pretty much those same assumptions. What comes out of this is actually quite interesting, because you get behaviour which is completely unlike a classic model. A classic model, broadly, is in the standard non-adaptive case, is, do you know what, basically, we're not very ambitious now because we've got discounting in the technology, and the discounting rate on impact and the cost of technology may come down a bit. So we gradually ramp up the expenditure, the investment over time, and on the right-hand side, the damages are also hugely accumulating, which is exactly what James said about the classic DICE result. If you have the opposite, which is the red line, you start out making more than twice as much effort, but actually you don't have to ramp that up, because that is adjustment investment in new technology systems, infrastructure, and in fact over time you have to spend less and less getting to grips with the problem, because you're beginning to solve it, you've adjusted the pathways, the technologies, and on the right-hand side, by about the 2070, on these numbers, the entire system has adjusted to effectively a zero carbon economy, which is the red line on the left. So you just get radically different behaviour. You also get a much more optimistic view, right? The total cost by the end of the century in the classic case is about 5 to 10 times the total cost in the adaptive case, because you're spending less on climate damages and on mitigation, because you've induced the innovation required to solve the problem at reasonable cost, rather than chasing an ever-rising hypothetical baseline based on the idea that we don't have a clue to innovate to do anything other than the fossil fuel future. So those were sort of the main points that I wanted to make by way of conclusion. I guess 4 headlines. First, there is overwhelming evidence that learning in technology and systems is central to economic development, can be approximately estimated, and is crucial to tackling climate change. We have seen evidence, efficiency improvements and clean energy policy deployments to date have delivered significant emission reductions and, more to the point, transformative reductions in costs of renewables, efficiency and increasingly electric vehicles. Economic analysis has mostly ignored these realities. It's been the other area of denial. Why? Because it kind of makes equilibrium economics very awkward and difficult, and the mathematics and the modelling very complicated, so it was easier to ignore it. To be useful, we have to expand beyond that kind of straitjacket. I'm tempted to say we should just ignore the results from any model that does not include endogenous technological change, but is still trying to model fundamentally technological systems over this century. So in my language, we need to broaden it to encompass all 3 domains of economic decision-making. And it matters, as I hope the modelling showed, taking account of learning, broadly interpreted, radically changes your perspectives on costs, on optimal policy, and indeed the political strategy, because you may have noticed along the way, you suddenly have a different world in which you are not sharing burdens. You are taking bets on investment and returns arising from the innovation that follows, so you can begin to talk about constructing clubs that are willing to do this and are looking to reap the economic benefits from it. On that note, I'll finish.
Thank you, Michael. Richard, corporate responsibility.
Right. Thank you, Adair. So what I want to talk a bit about is how to allocate responsibility for future climate damages and climate change to the corporations that extracted the carbon in the first place. The normative way of looking at responsibility is through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, passed or adopted in 1992, in which developed countries have common but differentiated responsibilities and should therefore take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects thereof. So the focus on nation states is really based on the historic emissions from each of the developed countries. They have grown wealthy from their past energy use, particularly their use of fossil fuels, and they therefore have the wealth and the skills and the moral responsibility to help address and lead adaptation to the problem. If you look at it over time, the 5 largest emitters, the US and China in particular, China in the yellow has overtaken the United States in recent years and now double the US emissions. But if you look at it cumulatively, we get a diagram like this in which the US historic burden of CO2 emissions is about 26% of the total cumulative emissions since 1750 from all fossil fuel and cement uses. And China and Russia each 10%, and the other countries way below that. But I want to focus on the corporations that extracted the carbon around the world and look at the responsibility that they have for not only their past emissions, but also looking forward to what they ought to be doing about it. And that is because historic emissions are the primary drivers of climate change. These companies have extracted the lion's share of fossil fuel resources that cause climate change. And by and large, they have misled consumers and investors and legislators on the risk of climate change for many years, particularly starting in the 1990s as the COP process started and the IPCC was formed in 1988 and so on. And they also have the technical skills, the capital, and the moral responsibility, in my view, to help address the problem that they have so handsomely profited from for many years. So we started the Carbon Majors project about 15 years ago with a small study of one firm, historically from 1882 to 2002, and documented both the direct emissions from its operations as well as the emissions downstream from the carbon in the products they extracted and purveyed to consumers around the world. That company started as Standard Oil and ended up as ExxonMobil. We then expanded that project to include 90 carbon major entities. 50 of them were the common investor-owned companies such as Royal Dutch Shell, BP, U.S. companies such as Peabody and ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, as well as a number of state-owned companies like Saudi Aramco, Statoil, Pemex, etc. We took the self-declared production estimates that they published on their own for annual production of coal, oil, and gas. We started with the earliest reports we can get our hands on in various libraries around the world to get their own statements about what their production was. We developed a methodology for reducing or deducting for non-energy uses of particularly liquid fuels. About 8% of total liquid fuels historically goes into sequestered uses like petrochemicals and road oil and such. So we wanted to just trace the emissions from the carbon in the production that they had per year into what was emitted to the atmosphere by consumers. That data is in physical units, so we converted that into metric tons of CO2 per company and by year. We accounted for mergers and acquisitions and allocated the responsibility for past production to the extant companies. And we went through a robust process of peer review for our emissions factors and our methodology overall. So here's one simple worksheet for one company, Peabody Coal in the US, with production in the left column and the summary of their annual production of coal in millions of tons, and the green column on the right. A more complicated picture emerges when you take a company like Chevron from 1912 through 2016, in which it's absorbed and merged with a number of other companies throughout its corporate history. Texaco, for example, Getty Oil, Gulf Oil, 76, etc. So that's one of the largest producers overall. And if you aggregate all the 90 carbon majors, we have attributed and traced emissions equal to 2/3 of all industrial sources of CO2, including from cement, since 1750, to these 90 carbon majors. And that's about 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide attributed to these companies, whereas global emissions of CO2 and methane, energy-related methane, is around 1.6 trillion tons of CO2. So if you take the historic view of the leading companies, if you compare it to total emissions from all industrial sources, we have the largest companies historically contributing about 55 or 60 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and going on the line. But we want to look at more recent emissions because responsibility is a function of when the science emerged around a consensus. When did the companies know that there was a problem with the fossil fuel emissions and their role in the fossil fuel industry? So since half of emissions have occurred since 1988, that's one benchmark. But we're also looking at the history of climate science and when corporations that are allegedly expert in the consequences of their products learned that there might be a problem with carbon production. If they were observant, they would have listened to President Johnson and his message to Congress in 1965 warning about atmospheric carbon dioxide and climate change based on our fossil fuel use. They certainly would have paid attention when the National Research Council came out with a nice report in 1979. And ExxonMobil in particular did their own rather in-depth scientific research on climate change, the carbon cycle, how much carbon gets absorbed by the oceans, for example. They put monitors and scientific instruments on tankers that they applied around the world. And they reported results to the management that there is a problem with the fossil fuel emissions, and it is a potential threat to the future of our company. Over the next several years, it seems like ExxonMobil's management ignored those early warnings and instead invested in a campaign of climate denial and obfuscation, which puts the risk of their potential litigation risk much higher than if nobody had known about it. And of course, the IPCC reports that followed that with 1995 that we have a discernible human influence on global climate. So if we took a look at just the emissions by the carbon majors since 1988, the list of companies changes in terms of Saudi Aramco topping the list, Gazprom, and go on down the line were individual companies. Pemex and BP is down in 6 and 7, and Royal Dutch Shell, et cetera, on down the list. But this is a quantified estimate of how much of all the carbon in their products ends up in the atmosphere. We then wanted to model the impact on those emissions with Miles Allen at Oxford and scientists and modelers at Union of Concerned Scientists to see how much of each company's contribution to atmospheric CO2 would lead to atmospheric CO2 increase over time, its radiative forcing, and its an impact on temperature and sea level rise, which is where we just published a paper in September in Climatic Change with Brenda Eckworthel et al., measuring just those things and attributed to each of the companies. So if you just look at the results for sea level rise, you have the historic contribution for companies since 1880 on the left panel, but if you just look at the panel on the right, it's this contribution to sea level rise traced back to these same companies and their contribution to atmospheric CO2 since 1980 alone, in percent of total sea level rise. So if we take the top company, Saudi Aramco, has slightly less than 1% of total sea level rise since 1980. It's a small number in terms of millimeters of attributed sea level rise, but if you convert that using data from Columbia University and other sources, we can convert what would be a 1 meter sea level rise and converting that to land inundated by 1 meter sea level rise at over 400,000 square kilometers. If you take that down to the millimeter scale that we use for company contributions, there's still hundreds of square kilometers of land lost from existing and current emissions attributed to these companies. Meanwhile, the leading oil and gas companies continue to project that we're going to dramatically overshoot what the IPCC and other scientists think is a science-based target for 2 degrees centigrade or less. Here's the EIA 450 parts per million scenario, which is more or less what we should be following. On the right panel, the model suggested by the RCP models at 2.6 is the blue dots towards the bottom right that descends rather rapidly from the current time, as both Michael and Adair have mentioned. But meanwhile, the corporations have a feeling that we will overshoot, that policy won't catch up with limiting their contribution and the extraction of fossil fuels. And so all these companies project that our emissions will far outweigh where we know emissions need to go. Now, in terms of the potential litigation risk traced back to these corporate contributions, we already have a case in Germany against the German coal mining company RWE. We have the New York and Massachusetts Attorney Generals investigating ExxonMobil for consumer and investor fraud, although primarily targeted and their misstatements of reserves and assets. We have a commission on human rights in the Philippines investigating 40 carbon majors for infringing on the human rights of Filipinos from past and future storms and damages. And over the summer, we have seen several cases filed in California by Marin County, by San Mateo County and Imperial Beach, as well as the cities of San Francisco and Oakland, against various assemblies of major oil and gas and coal companies for having caused sea level rise and causing infrastructure damage and costs incurred by citizens and asset owners, airports, harbor owners in San Francisco Bay and elsewhere. We also have reactions by the U.S. House of Science, Space, and Technology against the research that I and colleagues have done over time to identify these corporate contributions. They have investigated us and subpoenaed us for our records and emails, allegedly for having intimidated Exxon's own scientists and research on climate change and their First Amendment rights to do so. So I just want to read one review of the work that was contributed by Henry Shue, who was a political philosopher at the University of Oxford, who provided a commentary on our recent paper published in Climate Change recently. And he said that investor-owned companies have long understood the harm of their products, yet carried out a decades-long campaign to sow doubts about those harms in order to ensure fossil fuels would remain central to global energy production. Companies knowingly violated the most basic moral principle of do no harm, and now they must remedy the harm they caused. And I'll close with an opinion by the Guardian editorial board published just while Hurricane Irma was leaving Cuba, headed for South Florida. And what they wrote in the Guardian was, fossil fuel companies should be held accountable for the effects of climate change. Legal warfare has a twofold aim: to overhaul transgressors' business models so that they are in line with the global commitment to phase out fossil fuels and limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees centigrade, and to get them to pay for damages resulting from global warming. Climate litigation is the inevitable result of a failure of 2 decades of talks, but it is also an important way of reframing the climate crisis as a human rights emergency. Now, in closing, I am optimistic about not only technology, but also about human behavior, and individuals as well as corporate managers can learn to take account of climate change and to do what both companies and individuals can and should do to reduce corporate and individual emissions. But I think the pressure on oil and gas companies, particularly the ones headquartered in the United States that have done mostly investment in climate denial, is to hold their feet to the fire so that we can put pressure on them to align their future production and investments, capital investments, not only in future fossil fuels and in their reduction, but also in alternatives, and help fund carbon capture and sequestration, invest in renewables like Statoil and Total and other companies are doing, much more so than the U.S. companies. Thank you. I'll close with that.
Great. Richard, thank you very much.
I also have some copies of my background paper for INET if anyone wants to have some printed
so we
versions.
have quite a wide range of perspectives, completely complementary but covering different aspects. So I'm going to go straight to questions from the floor. We've got 15 minutes, and I'm going to take 3 at a time, and I might use the freedom also to add one of my own each time round I go. So I'm going to try and be fair. I'm going to be... You two up there, you've got to decide which of you. You're only getting one between the two of you. This is sort of, you know, so who's going to do it from that? Okay, you. Yep. You can stand up and tell us who you are, and do we have... We may not have microphones. We may have to shout. Are there microphones? Oh, could you come down and talk at that microphone there? Right. Okie doke. And then I'm going to go for this gentleman right up front. There you are. Could you go and get in line at the microphone? And then I'm going to... Andrew, did you? Andrew Schenk. I want Andrew Cheng as well. Can we all go to the microphone? Yeah, far away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your talks. I'm Daphne Vitran. I come from Oxford University. And I don't know, I see like lots of hope here and lots of also trust in technology. And I'm really thankful because this is kind of a sad topic. But also, I wonder if like there is not space in this kind of debate to talk about a more like kind of extreme maybe shift in our economic system. For example, talking about degrowth or talking about how are we going to face the challenges of producing to reach the extreme demand we have right now. Maybe it's sometimes, in my opinion, unnecessary, but you can see what you think. But I don't know. I think we should talk a little bit more about like a little bit more of a change in our economic system. And also I wanted to make a little comment of saying this, I think this debate should be a plenary session because, I don't know, it's weird that climate or environment in general has been left to the last and small session. I don't agree with that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Next.
Dennis Mollison. I like James's mention of the way of having a tax on carbon and giving back as a dividend equally to each household. I'd like to quick comment first that was an idea of the unitax movement in the 1970s, and Malcolm Cecil wrote a book which covers this, which was when they were talking about fuel running out rather than worrying so much about climate change. But it gets around one of the big drivers for politically demanding more energy usage, which is this whole idea of keeping prices down, which is the fuel poverty in a household, where you try and keep prices so low that people pay very little for their energy. And I think this is a way of making people accept that they need to pay more for their energy. So that's a great move at the individual level. At the corporation level, though, we're still subsidizing use of energy. It's a typical thing for instance, the government in Scotland here, which is surely one of the best in these things, is still wanting to subsidise new oil field production. How do we get the public to realise that's a bad thing?
Okay, great. Andrew?
Yeah, my name's Andrew Sheng, former securities regulator, and I thought but now interested in climate change. Actually first of all, I want to congratulate all four presentations, but I want to concentrate on Mr. Heede and Adair, because Adair is also a former securities regulator. If we agree that the carbon emission is bad for us, just like nicotine in cancer and cigarettes, why don't we mandate that every carbon-producing company, every listed company, should publicize in their annual report how much carbon emission they do every year? And so effectively, the name and shame would then cause them to actually take action in this area. Just a suggestion, but I would like to get your feedback.
Okay, so 3 questions. The first, I take to be basically, should we just consume less? Yeah, are we going to be able to do this by a technological fix and still keep up our growth and our consumption growth, or do we have to accept that we have to consume less? I actually think this relates to the question of carbon pricing, which is, I think, in terms of the supply of the energy we're currently using, we may need far less of a carbon price than we think. Jim put up a price of $200 per tonne. If you had a price on coal of $100 per tonne, and given that the most efficient coal-powered power station you will ever build in the world, and absolutely ultra supercritical, will never get better than 600 grams per kilowatt hour produced. That means that if you have a $100 carbon price, you would be adding 6 cents per kilowatt hour to coal-produced electricity. Given where renewables now are, that means that coal would be dead even if coal cost nothing, because renewables are going to be cheaper than 6 cents per kilowatt hour. But my own thought, and I want to know whether Michael and Jim might agree, is what we may need a high carbon price for is to stop what's called a rebound effect. That as we get cheaper renewable energy, actually we may get still cheaper fossil fuel energy, because one of the biggest inputs to energy production is the cost of energy. And unless we're very careful, that will just rebound, that we do even more flights. By the way, I suspect a lot of people got here by flight, so we've all got to think about that. We will just consume more. So do we need a carbon price, the way I put it is, or do we need other things to constrain energy demand and consumption demand? The second question was really about why do we keep on subsidizing things, and the third, very much for Richard, is should we make it mandatory to say what the carbon emissions are? And I'm sure you'll be able to comment on that within the context of carbon disclosure projects, etc.
Yeah.
Let's start with Jim, and then Michael, and then Richard. Jim.
Well, thank you very much. Briefly, I think let me start with Adair's comments and then work back. To me, it's not a question of whether we need carbon price or need other things. I think we need both. To me, it's clear that these are complementary policies. The extent of a rebound effect is a good question. It's one of the many uncertainties that we face, and that's why I believe that it's very important that in establishing a carbon price, we do so by setting a quantity trajectory and seeing what prices emerge from that rather than vice versa. I think a relatively low price would be sufficient to knock out coal as a viable way to produce electricity. But as you progress along that abatement curve, you're going to get into more and more expensive things, as you yourself mentioned in your introductory remarks. But we just don't know. So what we need is to set the quantity trajectory and see what prices we end up with. On the issue of subsidies, I think it's a very good point that in some ways it would seem bizarre that one would on the one side tax carbon emissions and on the other side subsidize fossil fuel production, but indeed the world is full of bizarre things. How do we get the public to know it's a bad thing? Boy, if I had a question like an answer to that, that would help solve one piece of the problem. There has been a fair amount of discussion of it, but I think getting it into the minds of the public and then getting into the minds of the politicians and holding them accountable, because these subsidies, of course, result from lobbying activities that persuade governments to give these subsidies. It's one of our challenges, one of our multiple challenges. I'd appreciate, by the way, the reference to the book you mentioned on the Unitax movement. I'd love to learn more about that. Finally, on the question of degrowth, I think in a way degrowth is perhaps a bit too broad brush a way to think about the challenge that we face, because the question is growth of what? GDP, of course, which is the way degrowth is usually conceived of, is a combination of things that are valuable to people, things that are harmful to people, and things that are useless, like the positional goods that were discussed the other night. And when we frame the argument in terms of pro-growth or degrowth, the pro-growth people tend to be thinking about the good stuff, and the degrowth people or anti-growth tend to be thinking about the bad stuff or the useless stuff. And the result is that we talk past each other. So my feeling is that what we really ought to be talking about is shrinking the bad stuff and growing the good stuff. And that's, to my mind, a little bit more fine-grained a way to approach this question than just degrowth. But shrinking the bad and growing the good does involve big changes, profound changes, not just tinkering at the margins with our economy. Yes.
Michael?
Yeah. First, actually, following James's presentation, I meant to add in one of the interesting things about that perspective I put in at the end is it starts to bring the cost-benefit to look very much like the science-based targets, whereas previously they've been pretty much on different planets. But also, I'd remind, almost the first remark I made was, and in relation to the first question about degrowth, alternative economic models, I stress we're using innovation in a very broad sense, not just technology innovation, but potentially social innovation, etc. I think that could be part of the frame. And I'm sometimes asked the question, but there's an important caveat, which is actually it's easy to say, oh, it's all because we all consume far too much stuff. Well, roughly speaking, a third of emissions arise from stuff that we consume. A third is from living in buildings where we want light and warmth. And a third is from travelling. So you could reduce the stuff that we buy to zero and you've still got 2/3 of the problem. And I think people are still going to want to stay warm and to travel around, including to international conferences. So it's kind of, it really is not that simple. I mean, there's got to be all sorts of progress in a number of ways and fronts. In terms of the subsidising energy and pricing, we do live in a weird world. Many countries subsidise energy. In many developing countries, it's mainly consumer subsidies to keep the final price down. Actually, in industrialised economies, we sometimes tax fuels to high heaven, like our transport fuels, but still subsidise the production, which is kind of bizarre, obviously, but it's a different sort of problem, and it reflects partly the political economy and partly security concerns. What they do all add up to is, of course, if we struggle to remove subsidies, we have to recognise that the political economy of pricing is phenomenally difficult. And I think that does also link a bit to the tax dividend and the second question in this, which is actually Australia tried something rather like the tax and dividend scheme, and I asked Frank Giotso, an economist there, so how did it fail? Because people began to get cheques through the post, and it was partly, well, there wasn't a real narrative of how this would solve the problem. It was just like, government's doing this stuff, which is just going to make you pay in your fuel bills instead of paying in your tax bills. And people said, well, why? And unless you have the narrative as to how this links with technological transformation that will solve the problem, then I think any carbon pricing scheme is going to encounter political problems. Finally, on the transparency, most companies actually, I think, most energy companies do publish how much fossil fuels they emit. Anybody can calculate it on the back of the envelope from their own stuff. It's really easy. What is really interesting actually is the Financial Stability Board extending that into the financial sector. And it's fascinating to see how scared some of the financial sector is about being expected to disclose the carbon intensity of their investment portfolio. And to me, that is the bigger game in town.
Richard?
Yeah. Adair mentioned the difficulty of replacing aircraft fuel, for example, and I must admit I came from Colorado to participate in this conference, and my round-trip carbon bill is 3 tons of carbon dioxide, which is about equal to my whole household for 1 year. And I'm reminded, I'm a geographer by training, but I'm reminded of a phrase that I heard when I was taking an economics class 45 years ago, that in reference to the first question about why climate change is a side issue at a conference like this. The phrase was, the Earth is a special case and can be safely ignored.
I remember that one.
With respect to, I think it was Mr. Chen's question and also Michael's reply, a lot of companies do quantify the emissions of their product as well as very detailed accounts of their operational emissions. They don't do so in their annual report. It's often hidden in their sustainability reports. As for the emissions from their products, they don't state that anywhere publicly. It's available through Carbon Disclosure Project, now known as CDP in London, with which I collaborate to make these quantifications for all of these carbon major companies on their behalf, until they step up and use a robust methodology and the same methodology for doing those estimates themselves, which are all across the board.
Good. Now, it's getting late, but I'm going to take 3 more, and I want you all to be very quick, and then we're going to have very quick answers, and there's a hell of a lot of people. Now, there's somebody up there. Yep, you. Come to the thing. It's Camilla Tolmoon there. Camilla, yep, you go there. And that lady in the middle there. Yep, you. And sorry to everybody else, that is all we're going to have time for. Far away.
Hi, my name is Yefim Vogel. I'm a PhD student in ecological economics at University of Leeds. I want to comment, maybe more than asking a question to the panel, but I guess we're up for debate.
Hang on, you're not allowed to comment unless you say, is that right?
Yeah, I will, of course, yeah.
Yeah, but no, come on, question as quickly as possible and not a long comment.
Yep. So I do want to discuss a bit more broadly about the issues of how are we tackling this issue? Is it only a technological fix or an economic fix, or is there something more deep about a societal change that is needed? And that's where I think we should reconcile this debate with everything else that has been going on at this conference, and look not only at this one planetary boundary, but also at the 8 others that are fundamentally linked to the way we use technology. If you talk about CCS, well, first, that's like technology not proven at all, that there's no leakage. And if you talk about the bio-CCS, that is very likely linked to a high issue of biodiversity loss, which is already way beyond the boundary, right? And then we have all these other issues of plastic, of the nitrogen cycle, and so forth, all of which are kind of used to the way we use technology, and all of which are used to the scale at which we use energy and products. And if we look at all the other topics that we've been talking about in terms of inequality, all those go back to this economic system that is based on growing production, growing consumption, and what we do, I feel, if we just build on solar panels and wind power. And by the way, these technologies are also associated with a dirty way of extraction and production. And there's rare earth metals and all these other things. Then we're going to produce the next gigantic companies.
Okay, I think we've got the idea. And it's basically there are a whole lot of other limits out there. So you're raising the question again, can we accept that we have a growing economy measured in the standard forms and simply make it more efficient?
No. We measure it in terms of material production.
Yeah, material.
And
we'll measure
solutions.
the way it is, GDP. And I think Michael's point is fundamental. If we're not going to, you've got to specify what you don't want, or what you don't want 4 billion Africans to want, right? Do you want them to have air conditioning or not? And do you want to have air travel or not? And that's actually going to be far more important to whether you want them to have physical goods or not. But it's a very important point. We'll see what the panel says. Right, next question. Yeah.
My name's Camilla Tallman. I'm from IIED. Michael, a quick question for you. Thanks for your lovely model of endogenous technological innovation. Can you unpack for us what you've got in the costs of change and what that means to things like political funding and lobbying rules? Adair, as chairman of INET and leader of so many very positive and progressive climate and energy initiatives, can you commit INET's next conference to putting ecology centre stage? Jim, can you say something about what's happened to the British Columbia fiscally neutral carbon pricing scheme introduced, in fact, by a pretty right-wing premier, but which I understood had got great traction on the ground? Thanks.
Okay, final question.
Hello, my name is Marta Boutruszewicz. I'm also with the University of Leeds. I have a question to you, Sir James. I wish on the figure where when you show that that the first quantile will pay 10% or over 10%, and the fifth quantile less than 8%, that you also show the distribution of emission related to all of those quantiles, because if I'm not wrong, 10 or 20% of the most wealthy people produce over 70% of emissions. And then if you want to tax households, I'm not sure if it's such a good idea, because using households as the scapegoats for what is given them from provision systems is a little bit unfair. Maybe we should change provision systems, not put the burden of straightforward poor people, because that's what that scheme showed, that we will tax people that are actually poor. To give an example, rural, if you compare urban and rural areas, those who live in rural areas that rely on transportation, and usually they're poorer than those who live in urban area. So
Okay, right, good. Okay, so I had one question and the answer is yes. Yeah, we'll put it on the main plenary session at the next INET conference. So that's the easy bit, right? So, very quickly, can we have a response to, there are a set of other limits out there. How do we integrate those other limits alongside the carbon limits? A set of questions from Camilla about, to Jim and to Michael. And the final one, should you just put this on households? My question is, who else? I mean, ultimately, households consume. Households consume. We consume. Okay, but that's just another way of doing it. I mean, Jim's actually does it at source, and then it flows through the system. Anyway, Jim can answer it.
Thank you. Well, let me start with that. Yeah, many of my friends in the climate justice movement take the view that pricing is sort of a bad thing because it involves markets, and they don't like markets very much. And they put forward slogans like keep the oil in the soil, keep the coal in the hole. What's important to recognize is that has exactly the same effects on people's real purchasing power, right? The way that putting a cap on the fossil fuels entering the economy works is it reduces their supply. Just like when OPEC wants to raise the price of oil, it reduces the supply, right? So if you succeeded in keeping the oil in the soil, if that's all you did, right, you would raise prices to consumers. They would be paying more because when quantity goes down, prices go up. And where would the money go in that case? It would go to the producers, the fossil fuel producers who don't keep their oil in the soil, right? That's where it would go, to the renegades who aren't cutting back their production. So it's quite important to understand the basic economics of this, that limiting supply is exactly what we want to do, but we want to do it in a way that is politically sustainable by keeping the purchasing power of ordinary working people intact, ideally equitable, egalitarian, by increasing the real incomes of those at the bottom of the pyramid, and, in my view, consistent with the philosophical principle of universal ownership of universal basic assets, in a way of starting the idea of basic income from upstream rather than a kind of tailpipe system where you redistribute at the end. Absolutely, it's true that the richer quantiles, and if I had had more graphs, I would have showed one like that, can have much bigger carbon footprints. That's precisely why, if you dividend back the money, you convert it from a regressive to a progressive policy, because you're transferring money from those who have outsized carbon footprints to everyone on the basis of equal shares in the carbon sink. Rural-urban differences are important. Those are among those horizontal differences that I mentioned at the very end. You know, some poor people actually would be still negatively impacted, even if you dividended back much of the money, and you might need special provisions for certain groups, of which rural people could conceivably be one. On the British Columbia system, I'm not an expert on that. I think it's been reasonably well received. It has a rather modest carbon price, I should say, but it demonstrates that these kinds of policies are feasible. They're not at all infeasible, and I think that, you know, British Columbia has been one of the pioneers in demonstrating that fact. If the prices got high enough to really have significant impacts, then all these issues I'm talking about would really become significant. If you're talking $30 a ton of carbon, 30 cents on a gallon of gasoline, I don't care how you distribute it. It's really not that big a deal.
Have to finish?
Stop. Yep, sorry.
Michael?
Yeah.
Choose which of those questions you want to answer. You don't have to cover them all.
Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe linking the first and last. You covered a lot of grounds, but the fact is it's been called the greatest market failure in history, the perfect moral storm, a super-witty problem. They're all true, right? It's all of the above. I think if you try and link it to every other environmental problem we could think of, I'm not sure that actually helps to solve it. Where I think the essential linkages is linking it to some of the wider economic debates that have been there, for example, throughout this conference. Because, for example, it's absolutely right. You put the cost on producers or on consumers directly, doesn't matter as long as the system basically passes all those costs through. Where it might make a difference is if there was some structural change, which meant that more of the resourcing of those efforts came out of shareholder rents rather than poor people paying energy bills. That's a structural economics problem which climate policy cannot solve on its own, for example.
Richard, final word for you.
When tobacco companies were litigated against and lost in court on tobacco injuries and harms, they were forced to help educate young people and smokers to get off of tobacco. And I think it's incumbent on the carbon industry to not only be public about where it wants its investments and its share of the carbon budget to go, but also to help educate manufacturers of automobiles as well as consumers of fuels to learn to use less fuel.
Excellent. Thank you to the panel. Thank you for all of you. And this is truly the end of this conference. Thank you very much.